The smoke rose from Corvath Prime like the breath of a dying god. 3 days had passed since humanity declared victory, though Declan Soros thought that word tasted like ash in his mouth. Victory implied something was won. All he could see was loss stacked upon loss. Bodies in metal twisted together until you couldn't tell where soldier ended and machine began. He picked his way through the wreckage with the careful steps of a man who had learned that unexploded ordnance didn't care about your good intentions. His medic's kit hung heavy on his hip, more habit than hope at this point. The survivors had been evacuated 30 hours ago. Command had called the sweep complete, but Declan had been a field medic for 11 years, and he had learned that Command's definition of complete often meant acceptable losses rather than actual thoroughness. The ship caught his attention because it didn't belong. Syndicate vessels had a brutal aesthetic, all sharp angles and weapon mounts bolted onto weapon mounts. Human craft were functional, designed by committees who thought creativity was a security risk. This thing was neither. It curved like water frozen mid-flow, its hull material shimmering with colors that hurt to look at directly. The crash had torn it open along one side, revealing corridors that seemed too large for the exterior dimensions. Declan stood at the breach for a long moment, running through the mental checklist of reasons not to enter. Unknown vessel, potential biohazard, possible booby traps. The list was extensive and sensible, and he ignored every item on it because he had heard something. A sound so faint it might have been imagination, but 11 years had taught him what a human breath sounded like when it was fighting to continue. He climbed inside. The interior defied his expectations of structural damage. Surfaces that should have been torn were merely bent, the material possessing a flexibility that human engineering hadn't achieved. Emergency lighting pulsed in soft blue waves, guiding him deeper into the corridor. The architecture felt ancient and impossibly advanced simultaneously, covered in flowing script that reminded him of water or wind made permanent. He found her beneath a collapsed section of what might have been the command center, white skin marked with burns that wept clear fluid, hair the color of harvest wheat, matted now with blood and debris. Her features were almost human, close enough that the differences jarred harder than total alienation would have. The ears swept back and upward, elongated into elegant points that lay flat against her skull in unconsciousness. Declan dropped to his knees and pressed 2 fingers to her throat, pulse present, though thready, respiration shallow but consistent. He had treated exactly 0 patients of her species in his career, which meant he was working blind, which meant he would do what medics always did when faced with the unknown. He would treat what he could see and pray that biology was more universal than politics. The armor she wore was beautiful in the way that weapons were beautiful, form and function married with an artistry that made his standard-issue trauma shears feel embarrassed to exist. He cut through the seals anyway, peeling back plates to expose the wounds beneath, burns along her ribs, deep enough to require grafting if her physiology matched human parameters. A puncture wound in her side that had been partially sealed by what looked like self-activating medical foam built into the armor itself. Clever. He'd have to remember that if he survived long enough for it to matter. He worked with the systematic efficiency that training had carved into his bones. Clean the wound. Assess the depth. Apply the appropriate treatment. He was halfway through spreading sterilization gel across the burn on her abdomen when her eyes opened. They were the color of deep space where stars were being born, purple and silver swirling in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than simple biology. She looked at him, at his hands on her bare skin, at the gel gleaming on his fingers. And when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made his spine straighten without his permission. "Do you know you're touching the Queen of the Galaxy, human?" Declan's hand stopped moving. His brain processed the words, cross-referenced them with every intelligence briefing he'd sat through, and arrived at a conclusion he deeply wished it hadn't. The sigils on her armor, the script on the walls, the ship that didn't belong to any faction in this war. Celestian. She was Celestian, and if she was calling herself Queen, that meant she was Vetriana Soltis, Architect Queen of the Celestian Dominion, ruler of an empire that made humanity's territories look like a small and poorly organized backyard. "With respect," Declan said slowly, "Your Majesty's wounds don't care about your title, and neither does sepsis. May I continue?" Those ancient eyes studied him with an intensity that made him feel like a document being read in a language he didn't know he was written in. 3 seconds passed. 5. 10. "You may continue," she said. Declan continued. His hands were steady because they had to be, because steadiness was what kept patience alive. Even patience who could apparently order his entire species wiped from existence with a word. The gel went on. The burns were dressed. The puncture wound was cleaned and resealed with fresh bandaging. She weighed less than he expected. Declan had carried wounded soldiers across battlefields thick with mud and debris, men and women whose armor added 30 kilograms to their frames. The Queen felt like carrying morning mist given form, though he suspected that impression had more to do with the material of her remaining armor than any actual fragility. Whatever the Celestians built their equipment from, it seemed to apologize for having mass at all. The medical station was 2 kilometers north, a prefabricated unit that had survived the bombardment through sheer architectural indifference. It squatted in a crater like something that had given up on dignity long ago. Its walls scorched but intact, its emergency power still humming the low note of continued function. Declan had marked it during yesterday's sweep, thinking it might prove useful. He hadn't imagined it would prove useful for hiding galactic royalty from search parties. He laid her on the examination table with the care he'd give any patient, and the additional awareness that this particular patient could probably have him executed in creative ways he'd never imagined. The table's diagnostic systems flickered to life, immediately confused by readings that didn't match any species in its database. It beeped in mechanical distress for several seconds before Declan switched it to manual mode. "Your equipment seems distressed," Vetriana observed. Her voice was weaker now, the authority still present, but wrapped in the gauze of exhaustion. "It's having an existential crisis," Declan said, gathering fresh supplies from the cabinets. "Apparently it wasn't programmed to handle patients who rule most of known space. I'll file a complaint with the manufacturer." The corner of her mouth moved. It might have been a smile or might have been a muscle spasm from the pain medication he hadn't given her yet. "I do not rule most of known space. The Dominion encompasses approximately 43% of charted territories. Humanity controls 6%. The Syndicate held 11% before your recent conflict reduced that figure. I stand corrected. 43% of space finds my diagnostic table inadequate." He approached with an injection cartridge, showing it to her before bringing it near her skin. "This is a broad-spectrum analgesic. I have no idea if it will work on your physiology, make you hallucinate colors that don't exist, or do absolutely nothing, but it's what I have." She studied the cartridge with those impossible eyes. "Celestian biology processes most human pharmaceuticals at approximately 60% efficiency. The compound you're holding will provide roughly 4 hours of moderate pain relief. It will also make me somewhat more talkative than I would prefer. Medical science thanks you for the warning." He administered the injection and watched her features soften slightly as the medication took hold. "When you said more talkative, should I be concerned about state secrets or just embarrassing childhood stories?" "I have no embarrassing childhood stories. I was performing statecraft before your species achieved faster than light travel." "That sounds like an embarrassing childhood story about being a very serious child." Again, that movement at the corner of her mouth. "You are impertinent. I'm a medic. Impertinence is how we cope with the constant proximity to death. Speaking of which," he pulled a chair close to the table and sat, checking her vitals with the manual instruments that didn't require species-specific calibration. "Why is the architect queen of the Celestian Dominion bleeding out on a planet where humanity just finished losing 50,000 soldiers to hold a position that might not matter in 6 months?" The silence stretched. Outside, the wind carried ash against the station's walls, a sound like whispered secrets in a dead language. Declan counted her heartbeats through his fingers on her wrist, steady enough to suggest the medication was working, irregular enough to remind him that she was far from stable. "I came to see," she said finally. 40 years I have maintained the Dominion's neutrality. 40 years of treaties and negotiations and careful balance. I watched your species and the Syndicate destroy each other through intelligence reports and diplomatic summaries, numbers, abstractions." She turned her head to look at him directly. I wanted to see what neutrality looks like when it wears a face. Declan thought about the field hospital 3 days ago, the children from the colony ship that took a stray torpedo, the mother who kept asking him to check on her daughter, not understanding that her daughter was the reason he couldn't meet her eyes. It looks like this, he said. Ash and fire and people who didn't choose any of it, paying the price for people who did. Yes, the word carried weight he hadn't expected. It looks exactly like this. A sound outside made them both freeze. Boots on debris. Voices speaking in the clipped cadence of military communication. Declan moved to the window, peering through the grime at a patrol passing 200 meters east. Human uniforms. His own people. He should signal them. He should report what he'd found. Protocol was clear about discoveries of this magnitude. He watched them pass and said nothing. You could end your career with a single transmission, Vetriana said from the table. Possibly earn a commendation. The intelligence value of a captured Celestian monarch would be immeasurable. Captured implies you're a prisoner, you're a patient. Declan returned to his chair. Besides, my career ended when I refused to abandon a civilian shelter during the retreat from Meridian Station. Command was very clear about their disappointment. The orbital bombardment began on the second night. Declan heard the whistle first, that terrible sound that every soldier learned to fear, the atmosphere screaming as something massive and violent tore through it. He had Vetriana off the table and moving toward the emergency hatch before the first impact shook the ground. The bunker beneath the medical station was a relic from an earlier conflict, dug deep enough into the bedrock that it had survived 3 separate wars. It smelled of recycled air and old fear, the walls still bearing marks from previous occupants who had scratched prayers or curses or simple tallies of days survived. Declan helped the Queen down the ladder, mindful of her wounds, and sealed the hatch above them as the world turned to thunder. Syndicate remnants, he said, checking the bunker's limited systems. Must have regrouped faster than intelligence predicted. The bombardment pattern suggests they're targeting anything that might hold survivors. Your intelligence services predicted they would require 2 weeks to re-establish orbital capability. Vetriana lowered herself onto the single cot, with a grace that seemed offended by the accommodation. They appear to have achieved it in 3 days. You have access to our intelligence services? I have access to everyone's intelligence services. It is remarkably easy when you control 43% of the communication relays. Declan absorbed this information and filed it under topics he would worry about when he wasn't trapped underground during an orbital bombardment. The bunker supplies were minimal but present. Water recycler functioning, emergency rations for approximately 10 days, medical supplies that wouldn't have passed inspection 6 months ago, but would serve. He began organizing them with the methodical efficiency of a man who needed to do something with his hands. You are stress organizing, Vetriana observed. I'm creating a functional inventory system. You have moved that container of nutrient paste 4 times, each time to a position of equal accessibility. You are stress organizing. He set down the container. How do Celestians cope with being trapped in small spaces during planetary bombardment? We do not typically find ourselves in such situations. The Dominion has not faced a credible military threat in 200 years. She paused, considering. I imagine we would stress organize as well, though we would call it something more dignified. Tactical resource assessment, perhaps? The ground shook again, dust falling from the ceiling in thin streams. Declan checked the structural integrity readings and found them acceptable, which meant they would probably survive unless a torpedo hit directly overhead, in which case the readings would be irrelevant. He sat on the floor across from the cot, back against the cold wall, and allowed himself to breathe. Tell me about the shelter, Vetriana said. Which shelter? The civilian shelter you refused to abandon, the one that ended your career. Declan was quiet for a long moment. The bombardment continued above them, muffled now by meters of rock and reinforced concrete. Meridian Station was a mining colony, 12,000 civilians, mostly families. When the syndicate pushed through the defensive line, command ordered a full evacuation, transports for military personnel and essential equipment. He picked at a scratch on his boot. The civilian transports were still 6 hours out. Command decided we couldn't wait. And you remained. I was running the field hospital. 43 patients, most of them children from the habitat dome that took the first hit. Command said leave them. Acceptable losses. The words tasted like the ash outside. I told them to court-martial me from orbit because I wasn't moving. What happened? The civilian transports arrived 4 hours late. We lost 11 patients during the wait. Would have lost more if I'd tried to move them. He met her eyes in the dim emergency lighting. Command was very understanding about the whole thing. They only demoted me twice and assigned me to the unit with the highest casualty rate in the sector. This unit, 93% fatality rate over 18 months. I'm the only one left. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. They probably thought the syndicate would solve their discipline problem for them. The Queen was silent, her expression unreadable. Above them, another impact sent tremors through the stone. The lights flickered, steadied, flickered again. I signed the Treaty of Corvath, she said quietly. 17 years ago. It established the boundaries of acceptable conflict between your species and the syndicate. It defined which weapons could be used, which territories could be contested. Her voice carried something he hadn't heard before. Not authority, not command. Something closer to confession. I thought I was limiting the damage, containing the violence to regions where it could be managed. And instead I gave both sides permission to slaughter each other efficiently. The treaty didn't prevent war. It organized it. She closed her eyes. 43 treaties in 40 years. Each one a compromise I told myself was necessary. Each one a choice to look away while people like you buried patients you couldn't save. Declan considered several responses. Platitudes about doing her best. Reassurances that leadership required difficult decisions. Instead, he reached into the ration container and pulled out 2 nutrient bars, tossing one onto the cot beside her. Dinner, he said. They taste like compressed disappointment, but the calorie content is adequate. She looked at the bar. You are changing the subject. I'm feeding my patient. There's a difference. The Celestian fleet arrived on the 5th day, and Declan learned that his understanding of scale had been tragically limited. He had seen human dreadnoughts, vessels that stretched kilometers long and bristled with enough weaponry to crack moons. The Celestian flagship made them look like medical instruments next to surgical suites. It hung in the sky above Corvath Prime, like a second sun, deciding whether to rise or fall, its hull catching light in ways that suggested dimensions he couldn't properly perceive. Vetriana had activated her emergency beacon the night before, once her strength had returned enough to access the biometric locks on her remaining armor. She had explained the process with the casual tone of someone describing routine correspondence, though Declan noticed her hands weren't entirely steady. Whatever signal the beacon sent, it had apparently been received with some urgency. They emerged from the bunker to find shuttles descending through the ash-choked atmosphere, sleek vessels that moved like thoughts given form. Soldiers in armor that made Vetriana's damaged suit look like everyday wear formed a perimeter around the medical station. Their weapons trained outward with the discipline of troops who had never faced a credible threat, but trained for one constantly. An officer approached, her elongated ears pinned back in an expression Declan couldn't read, but suspected wasn't friendly. She spoke in a language that flowed like music played on instruments that didn't exist, and Vetriana responded in kind. The conversation was brief. The officer's gaze shifted to Declan, with an assessment that made him feel like a specimen. Admiral Thesara wishes to know why you haven't killed this human, Vetriana said, her tone conversational. That seems rude. I did save your life. She considers that irrelevant to the security protocols involved. The Queen turned to the Admiral and spoke again in that flowing tongue. Whatever she said made the Admiral's expression shift through several configurations of displeasure before settling on reluctant acceptance. What did you tell her? That you are my personal physician and your death would be medically inconvenient. I'm not sure that's how medicine works. I am the architect, Queen. Medicine works however I declare it works. The flagship's interior matched its exterior in the category of making Declan feel extremely small and inadequately evolved. Corridors stretched in curves that his eyes insisted were straight. Lighting came from sources he couldn't identify. The air tasted like the memory of spring on a planet that had never known winter. He was escorted to quarters that were either a generous room or a comfortable cell, depending on perspective. A medical team arrived within the hour, 7 Celestians with equipment that made his field kit look like stone tools. They examined Vetriana's wounds with expressions that cycled through horror, confusion, and grudging respect. The lead physician, a tall figure with ears that curved like question marks, spent several minutes studying Declan's bandaging work before speaking. The human's technique is crude, they announced, but effective. The infection was prevented. The tissue will regenerate without significant scarring. High praise, Declan said. It was not intended as praise. It was intended as a clinical assessment. I'll take what I can get. The following days blurred together in a haze of displacement. Declan was measured, scanned, and subjected to tests he didn't understand by personnel who didn't explain. He was given clothing that fit perfectly despite no one taking his sizes. He was fed meals that tasted like concepts rather than ingredients. He was assigned a translation device that rendered Celestian speech into flat, effectless English that stripped all music from the words. The court learned of the Queen's survival in stages, each revelation rippling outward through the Dominion's communication networks. Declan understood perhaps a tenth of the political implications, but that tenth was enough to recognize catastrophe in motion. The untouchable Queen had been touched, the immortal symbol had bled, and a human had seen it all. Admiral Thesara summoned him on the 4th day, her office a space of severe geometry and implicit threat. She stood behind a desk that might have been carved from frozen starlight and regarded him with the warmth of vacuum. "You will tell me exactly what transpired on the surface," she said. "Every word the Queen spoke, every moment of vulnerability you witnessed." "With respect, Admiral, that information is covered under physician-patient confidentiality. You are not a physician. You are a field medic with a discipline record that suggests chronic insubordination. Field medics are physicians. We just get worse equipment and more interesting patients." Declan met her stare without flinching. 11 years of facing death had cured him of intimidation by superior officers, regardless of species. "The Queen was injured. I treated her injuries. Everything else is between her and me." The Admiral's ears flattened in what he now recognized as anger. "You understand I could have your memories extracted. The technology exists. The authorization would be trivial. Then why haven't you?" Silence stretched between them, filled with implications neither voiced. Declan knew the answer. The Queen had forbidden it. Whatever reason Vetriana had for protecting his mind, the Admiral couldn't override it without consequences she wasn't prepared to face. The palace worlds of the Celestian Dominion existed in a state of beauty that felt like aggression. Declan had grown up on a mining colony where aesthetics meant choosing which shade of gray to paint the corridors. He had served on military vessels where design philosophy began and ended with functionality. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for cities that grew like crystal forests, for skies painted with aurora that responded to the collective mood of the population, for architecture that seemed to breathe. His medical bay was located in a wing of the royal complex that he suspected had been hastily repurposed from something more dignified. The equipment was extraordinary, centuries beyond anything human medicine had achieved. And he spent his first week simply learning which devices did what. The Celestian medical text had been translated for him, though the translations often raised more questions than they answered. What exactly was a harmonic cellular resonance, and why did treating it require musical notation? Vetriana visited on the 8th day. She arrived without announcement, without escort, slipping through his door like a memory of smoke. Her wounds had healed completely, the Celestian regeneration technology erasing even the faintest scar. She wore robes that shifted color with her movement, and her hair had been restored to its full length, falling past her shoulders in waves of pale gold. "Your bay is inadequate," she said, examining his equipment with a critical eye. "I've submitted 17 requisition forms. Apparently the procurement department isn't sure I exist. You exist in a bureaucratic category that has no precedent. The forms are likely circulating through approval chains that haven't been used in centuries." She picked up a human-designed scanner he'd brought from the surface, turning it over in her hands. "You kept this. It still works. More importantly, I understand how it works. Your equipment is impressive, but I can't fix it if it breaks. A reasonable philosophy. She set down the scanner and looked at him directly. I am told you refused to provide Admiral Thesara with information about our time on Corvath Prime. I told her to file a complaint with my licensing board. I don't think she appreciated the humor. She did not. She has requested your execution 4 times in the past week. Vetriana's tone remained conversational, as though discussing weather patterns. I have denied each request. She is becoming creative in her justifications. Should I be concerned? You should be aware. Concern is optional. She moved to the window, gazing out at the impossible cityscape. I have not been touched without political calculation in 37 years. Every handshake, every formal greeting, every moment of physical contact has carried implication. Alliance, submission, threat, the language of bodies in service of power. Declan waited. He had learned in the bunker that she would find her way to the point, and that pushing only made her retreat into formality. You touched me without any of that, she continued. You cleaned my wounds and dressed my burns, and never once considered what it meant beyond the immediate medical necessity. Do you understand how rare that is? I was doing my job. Yes, that is precisely the point. She turned to face him. In 40 years of rule, no one has simply done their job around me. Everyone performs. Everyone calculates. Every action is weighted with consequence and ambition. You treated me as a patient. Nothing more, nothing less. You were a patient. You still are, technically. The follow-up care recommendations I've been reviewing suggest monthly examinations for the first year after trauma of that severity. Is that your professional opinion? It's the textbook recommendation. I'm adapting it based on available information. She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her features from imperial to almost human. You are very dedicated to maintaining the fiction that your continued presence is medically justified. It's not a fiction. Your cellular regeneration was impressive, but I'm seeing some anomalies in the deep tissue scans that warrant monitoring. Also, I have nowhere else to go. My species is 6% of known space, remember? The options for a disgraced medic with knowledge of royal vulnerabilities are limited. You could sell that knowledge. Several intelligence services would pay handsomely. I could, but then I'd have to live with myself, and I've found that's harder than it sounds. He pulled up a display showing her latest scans. Besides, the anomalies I mentioned, they're real. Your body healed faster than your cellular memory updated. There's a lag between what your tissues are doing and what they think they're doing. It's probably nothing, but probably isn't certainly. She approached the display, studying the readings with an understanding that surprised him. You believe continued monitoring is genuinely necessary. I believe continued monitoring is prudent. Necessary is a stronger word than the data supports. He met her eyes. But I also believe you didn't come here to discuss medical anomalies. You came here because this is the one place in your palace where no one expects anything from you except to be a patient. The silence that followed was comfortable rather than tense. Outside, the aurora shifted through shades of violet and gold. Somewhere in the complex, decisions were being made that would shape the futures of billions. In the medical bay, a queen and a medic stood in the quiet space between duty and something neither had words for. The assassin came on a Tuesday, which Declan found oddly appropriate. Tuesdays had always been his least favorite day, trapped between the promise of a new week and the momentum needed to finish it. He was reviewing cellular regeneration protocols when the door to his medical bay slid open and a figure in maintenance clothing raised a weapon that hummed with lethal intent. Declan moved without thinking, 11 years of battlefield instinct overriding the paralysis of surprise. He threw himself sideways as the first shot scorched the air where his chest had been, crashed into a supply cart, and came up holding the only weapon available, the human scanner. He hurled it with desperate accuracy and caught the assassin in the throat, buying himself 3 seconds of gasping confusion. Those 3 seconds were enough. He closed the distance, drove his knee into the attacker's midsection, and wrenched the weapon away with a technique he'd learned from a sergeant who believed medics should know how to create injuries as well as heal them. The assassin collapsed, wheezing, and Declan stood over them with a racing heart and the dawning realization that someone wanted him dead badly enough to infiltrate the most secure palace in the galaxy. The security response was immediate and overwhelming. Celestian guards flooded the corridor, their weapons drawn, their expressions suggesting they weren't sure whether to protect him or arrest him. Admiral Thessara arrived within minutes, her satisfaction poorly concealed as she examined the unconscious assassin. "A human agent," she announced. "Clearly you have enemies among your own species. Clearly someone wants to silence what I know." Declan met her gaze steadily. "The question is, who benefits from that silence?" The Admiral's ears twitched in what he now recognized as discomfort. Before she could respond, the crowd parted for a presence that required no announcement. Vetriana moved through her guards like light through water, her attention fixed on Declan with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "You are injured," she said. "A scratch. The shot grazed my arm." "You are injured," she repeated, and this time it wasn't an observation. It was something closer to fury, though directed at circumstances rather than him. She turned to Thessara. "Admiral, you will explain how an assassin penetrated palace security." "Your Majesty, the investigation is ongoing." "The investigation will conclude that this is the fourth attempt on his life in as many weeks. The investigation will conclude that my explicit orders regarding his protection have been inadequately implemented." Vetriana's voice carried the weight of mountains deciding to move. "The investigation will conclude, Admiral, or I will find someone who can conclude it for you." Thessara's face went pale in a way Declan hadn't known Celestians could achieve. She bowed stiffly and withdrew, leaving the medical bay in a silence that hummed with aftermath. Vetriana crossed to him, her hands finding his arm with a gentleness that contradicted her recent display of authority. She examined the wound herself, her touch clinical but lingering. "This requires treatment. I can treat it myself. Occupational advantage. You will allow me." It wasn't a request. She guided him to the examination table and retrieved supplies with a familiarity that suggested she had been paying attention during his explanations of human medical procedures. Her movements were careful, precise, entirely focused on the task. "You're surprisingly good at this," Declan said. "I had an excellent teacher. He talked constantly while he worked. I believe it was his way of managing stress." She applied the antiseptic with steady hands. "I am going to address the High Council tomorrow. About security protocols? About humanity." She met his eyes. 40 years of neutrality ends tomorrow. I am placing your species under Dominion protection. Full integration into our defensive treaties. An end to the careful distance that allowed the Syndicate war to continue." Declan stared at her. "That will change everything. The political implications alone." "The political implications are my concern." She finished bandaging his arm and didn't release his hand. "I have spent 4 decades making decisions based on implications. Treaties balanced on calculations of power and advantage. I told myself it was wisdom. It was cowardice dressed in diplomatic language. Vetriana, on Corvath Prime, in that bunker, you asked me why I came. I told you I wanted to see what neutrality looked like." Her grip tightened slightly. "What I did not tell you is what I saw. I saw a man who chose to help when helping was dangerous, who refused to abandon patients because principles mattered more than survival, who looked at a queen and saw only a patient who needed care." "I was doing my job," he said quietly. "You were being what I had forgotten rulers could be, present, accountable, willing to touch the wounds instead of managing them from a distance." She released his hand but didn't step back. "Tomorrow I tell the Council that humanity deserves protection. I will cite strategic considerations, economic advantages, the balance of power. I will not tell them the truth, which is that one human reminded me power means nothing if it cannot kneel to help another, that some wounds require more than medicine." Her smile was small but genuine. "That sometimes the most radical act is allowing yourself to be cared for by someone who sees you bleeding and simply decides to help." The aurora outside painted the room in shifting colors. Somewhere the galaxy continued its ancient dance of politics and power. But in the medical bay, a queen and a medic stood in the space they had built together, no longer patient and physician, but something unprecedented. Something that had begun in ash and found its way to starlight. "So," Declan said, "same time tomorrow for your follow-up examination?" Vetriana laughed, a sound he suspected few had ever heard. Same time tomorrow. And every day after, I think. Some conditions require ongoing treatment. Medically speaking, I agree completely. I thought you might.